A question that seems contemporary in nature actually has roots far older than the present era. The wish to engage in sexual activity without resulting in offspring did not arise from the 20th century, or from the sexual revolution, or from the development of the birth control pill. This ranks among the most ancient human wishes documented in records, and the efforts to fulfill that wish by deliberately stopping pregnancy stretch back much farther than most individuals typically assume. Such efforts appear in records from many cultures and eras, with a level of consistency that shows this was never a side issue of limited interest. It was instead a concern shared by people everywhere. Humans have always sought ways to manage their own fertility. The particular approaches they employed covered a spectrum from those that turned out unexpectedly successful, to those that were truly dangerous, to those that involved inventive conceptual ideas. Certain approaches succeeded while others failed, and reviewing the history of the attempts people made, the reasons they made them, and the degrees of success they achieved provides substantial insight into how ancient peoples understood their bodies, their surroundings, and the links between those elements. We begin with the earliest recorded proof, since that proof is older than most people would expect. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical document from around 1825 BC, holds what are almost certainly the earliest written prescriptions for contraception that still exist. The formulas it outlines feature a pessary, which is basically an internal barrier device created from crocodile dung combined with fermented dough and meant to be placed inside before sexual activity. A further formula relies on a blend of honey and natron, which is the sodium carbonate salt applied widely in Egyptian, religious, and everyday settings. Crocodile dung, used as a contraceptive, deserves a moment of recognition before continuing. The ancient Egyptians faced the matter of unwanted pregnancy and proposed using crocodile dung as a solution, and from a modern chemical perspective, that approach may have produced some actual effect. Crocodile dung is alkaline, and alkaline settings harm sperm, which favor a mildly acidic pH. The fermented dough would have strengthened that impact. It did not function as a dependable contraceptive in any consistent way, yet it was not entirely based on magical ideas either. It represented an effort to apply observed chemical reasoning to a biological challenge with the substances on hand in a setting where crocodiles were common enough to supply the material on a regular basis. The honey and natron blend was likewise not unreasonable from a chemical viewpoint. Honey possesses mild antimicrobial and spermicidal qualities that current studies have verified. Natron is strongly alkaline. Neither substance serves as a dependable contraceptive, yet neither is completely without effect. In the setting of what could be obtained around 1825 BC, these stood as real efforts at medicine, grounded in evidence applied to managing reproduction. They worked with the restricted set of pharmacological options available in the ancient world, and sought to achieve something practical with those options. That exceeds what can be claimed for much of ancient medical practice. Egypt was not unique in this regard. Ancient Mesopotamian documents include mentions of contraceptive mixtures. Ancient Indian documents from the Ayurvedic tradition outline many approaches for stopping conception, including oil-based preparations used before intercourse and assorted herbal formulas taken by mouth. Ancient Chinese medical documents hold comparable content. The pattern holds steady. In every place where human societies created written records, those records contain efforts to stop pregnancy, which indicates that the practice almost certainly began well before writing developed by a substantial amount of time. The issue then becomes how far into the past it extends, and answering that calls for considering what sorts of evidence could possibly remain from periods before written records existed. Biological evidence drawn from actual prehistoric groups points in an intriguing direction. Archaeological and skeletal examinations of prehistoric groups regularly reveal birth spacing, meaning the interval between births, that lasts longer than would occur if women simply became pregnant at the highest possible biological rates. Hunter-gatherer women, both in the archaeological findings and in present-day traditional societies, usually space children about 3 to 4 years apart, rather than at the theoretical maximum of 1 to 2 years. Part of this spacing comes from prolonged breastfeeding, which reduces ovulation through hormonal processes. Part comes from the relatively low body fat levels of active hunter-gatherer women, which also influences fertility. Yet researchers examining present-day traditional societies have linked some of the spacing to intentional practices meant to prevent or space out pregnancies. The spacing was not wholly by chance. It was managed, at least in part, with whatever tools and understanding were on hand. The plant world holds the most substantial and most intriguing evidence. across a vast array of traditional cultures on every inhabited continent, examined by ethnobotanists and anthropologists over the last century and a half, there exists a steady body of knowledge about plants that have contraceptive, abortifacient, or fertility-influencing qualities. The particular plants differ by area, since the plant life of sub-Saharan Africa differs from that of North America or Southeast Asia. Yet the types of plants employed and the ways of using them display striking consistency across cultures that never had any contact with one another. This consistency is not accidental. It stems from the reality that plant secondary metabolites, which are the chemical compounds plants create for their own biological needs, including protection against insects and fungal threats, include a notable number of compounds that interact with mammalian reproductive systems. Plants did not create these compounds so humans could use them as contraceptives. They create them for unrelated purposes. Yet the interaction with mammalian hormones and reproductive biology is genuine and was uncovered by human groups through observation and testing over very extended spans of time. Someone observed an effect. That person shared it with another. The knowledge built up generation after generation through the particular informal pathways by which traditional medical knowledge held by women was passed along. Queen Anne's lace, also known as wild carrot or Daucus carota, stands as perhaps the best documented case of a plant with traditional contraceptive application across separate cultures. Seeds of wild carrot were noted by Hippocrates in the 5th century BC as a contraceptive, and they continue to be used in traditional medicine in parts of South Asia in the present day. Current research has shown that wild carrot seeds hold compounds that disrupt progesterone production and implantation, and animal studies have verified anti-fertility impacts. It is not a dependable or safe contraceptive by any modern clinical standard. The amount needed for an effect sits close to the amount that produces toxicity. Yet, it is not without pharmacological activity either. Something real occurs at the biochemical level when the seeds are consumed in the proper amounts, which exceeds what can be said for many medical treatments used throughout the ancient world. Silphium provides the most striking case of ancient contraceptive plant use, and it is also the most unfortunate because demand drove it to extinction. Silphium was a plant that grew solely in a particular area of North Africa, near the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene in the region now called Libya. It received extensive description from ancient writers, including Hippocrates, Theophrastus, Dioscorides, and Pliny the Elder, as possessing strong contraceptive and abortifacient qualities, and it was valued so highly that it became the main export and economic base of Cyrene. It appeared on the city's coins and was traded throughout the Mediterranean world at prices that made it one of the most prized goods of the ancient period, worth its weight in silver, according to some reports, and worth more than gold, according to others. The demand for silphium, driven largely by its standing as a contraceptive, was apparently so strong and so ongoing that harvesting wiped it out. By the 1st century CE, it had vanished. The final known supply was reportedly sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Ancient writers describe it with a level of detail and consistency, covering the dose, the method of use, the effects, and the difference between its contraceptive and abortifacient uses at varying doses, that indicates the reputation rested on actual observed results rather than pure superstition or promotion. What compounds it held, and precisely how they functioned, is a matter we can no longer resolve because the plant no longer exists. An entire species was used up into non-existence by the demand generated by its own value. That constitutes a particular and rather remarkable form of loss. Pennyroyal Artemisia species, pomegranate seeds, juniper berries, blue cohosh, wild ginger, and cotton root bark appear across Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, indigenous, American, and African traditional medicine, with consistent accounts of fertility influencing contraceptive or abortifacient qualities. Pharmacological studies on many of these plants have verified that they hold bioactive compounds with impacts on reproductive hormones, implantation, or uterine activity. The effectiveness and safety levels differ greatly. Some of the traditional abortifacients function partly by poisoning the mother to an extent that also ends the pregnancy, which is as concerning as it appears, and which ancient medical writers were at times fully aware of and recorded. Yet the pharmacological basis behind the traditional knowledge is genuine. These plants hold substances that produce effects on reproductive biology. The ancient Greeks and Romans were especially thorough in recording contraceptive practices, and the remaining texts from these traditions provide the most detailed accounts we possess from the ancient world. Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician working in Rome in the 2nd century, produced a gynecological work called Gynaikia that includes a lengthy and notably structured section on contraception and abortion. His method stands out as advanced for the era. He carefully separates contraceptives, which are substances that stop conception, from abortifacients, which are substances that end an existing pregnancy. And he observes that contraception is better than abortion, both for effectiveness and for the health of the woman. He outlines a ranking of approaches arranged by reliability and safety, and he recognizes the balances between effectiveness and safety in a manner that shows real clinical reasoning rather than mere pharmacological hopefulness. His suggested approaches feature barrier techniques, wool pessaries soaked in assorted substances including olive oil, cedar resin, white lead, and pomegranate pulp, along with oral preparations taken before or after sexual activity. Some of his suggestions carry clear pharmacological reasoning that holds up under modern examination. Olive oil and cedar resin both possess spermicidal qualities, verified by current research. Pomegranate seeds hold phytoestrogens, which are plant compounds that imitate estrogen and that influence the hormonal setting in ways connected to fertility. White lead is truly effective at destroying things, including sperm, though it also harms the woman over time through lead poisoning, which constitutes a major drawback that Soranus apparently viewed as an acceptable exchange under certain conditions. Ancient medicine was not always marked by what we would describe as a complete, long-term evaluation of risks. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BC, refers to contraception as a usual practice among the women of Rome, treating it as ordinary and widely familiar rather than as a specialized medical procedure. This offhand mention itself serves as evidence. When a poet presents something as ordinary background detail, rather than as noteworthy subject matter, it indicates the practice was common enough that the audience needed no further explanation. The Talmud, the central text of rabbinic Jewish law, assembled over several centuries, holds extensive discussion of contraception and its allowance under various conditions, including specific reference to a contraceptive device called a moke, a material placed before intercourse to stop conception, and oral contraceptive preparations called a cup of roots. The discussion is legal and philosophical rather than purely medical, yet the basic premise that effective contraception exists and that the legal issue concerns when it is allowed to use it shows that the methods under discussion were viewed as actually functioning to some meaningful extent. Lengthy legal arguments about the conditions under which something is allowed are not written if that something consistently produces no result. Physical barrier approaches show up across several ancient traditions in forms that represent real engineering responses to the same mechanical challenge. Beyond the Egyptian pessary formulas and the Greek and Roman wool pessaries, there are mentions in various ancient texts of something that functions like a condom coverings for the male genitals used during intercourse. Ancient Egyptians seem to have employed linen sheaths, possibly for disease prevention as much as for contraception, though the two purposes are not exclusive of each other. Evidence from ancient Japanese traditions points to similar coverings made from tortoise shell and later from animal intestine, which sounds highly uncomfortable in ways that help explain why barrier contraception has historically seen less use than its theoretical effectiveness would suggest. Ancient Rome employed goat bladder for the same purpose. The underlying idea was grasped across multiple separate traditions, even if the particular forms differed widely. Withdrawal, also known as coitus interruptus, appears so widely across traditional cultures and historical eras that it needs no specific documentation from particular ancient sources. It is noted in the Hebrew Bible in the account of Onan, from which it takes one of its historical names. It is described by ancient medical writers as a usual practice. It is recorded in virtually every traditional society ever examined in any region of the world. Its effectiveness as a contraceptive is genuine, yet incomplete. Current estimates indicate it lowers pregnancy risk by about 73% depending on consistent and correct application, which is a range that reveals everything about how consistent and correct application differs in real use. As a method that is freely available, costs nothing, and requires no advanced preparation, its attractiveness across essentially the full range of human history needs no further explanation. Lactational amenorrhea, the reduction of ovulation through prolonged breastfeeding, was likely the most widely employed and most effective ancient contraceptive approach, though labeling it a method suggests a degree of intentional strategic use that may not always have matched how modern people would view it. Prolonged breastfeeding reduces the hormonal signals that start ovulation, and in groups where breastfeeding was intensive and extended, which it was in most traditional societies, often until the child reached 2 or 3 years of age, this impact created meaningful birth spacing without any further steps. Whether ancient groups grasped the hormonal process or simply noticed that extended nursing tended to postpone the next pregnancy remains unclear. Yet the practical observation would have been open to any careful person living in the community over time, and it would have been accurate. Some traditional societies seem to have intentionally prolonged breastfeeding, at least partly for its contraceptive impact, rather than solely for nutritional purposes. Anthropological evidence from present-day traditional societies includes direct statements from women about the contraceptive reason for extended nursing. Whether this understanding is ancient or a more recent buildup of community observation cannot be established with certainty. Yet the effect itself is as old as human breastfeeding, and the observation of the effect is probably nearly as old. Abstinence and limits on sexual activity during particular parts of the menstrual cycle appear in various ancient medical and religious systems as a means of managing reproduction. The idea of a fertile window, the span during which conception can occur, was recognized as existing across ancient medical traditions, even if its actual timing was usually identified incorrectly. Hippocrates held that conception was most probable right after menstruation, which is roughly the least fertile portion of the average cycle. This meant that ancient efforts at rhythm method-style abstinence were often carried out at exactly the wrong moment, offering little or no real contraceptive protection while producing a mistaken sense of safety. The true timing of ovulation in mid-cycle, about 2 weeks before the next menstrual period, was not accurately grasped until the 20th century. For the full length of recorded history before roughly 1930, anyone attempting to use cycle timing as a contraceptive was relying on information that was not merely incomplete, but actively wrong in its most critical aspect. The social and economic aspects of reproductive management in ancient societies merit more focus than they usually receive, because the reason for avoiding pregnancy was not merely personal choice. It was set within complex social systems that assigned different weight to childbearing for different people in different situations. In ancient Rome, enslaved women had the clearest and most pressing need for contraceptive knowledge. Pregnancy for an enslaved woman meant a child born into slavery, and the social reality of sexual violence against enslaved people made unwanted pregnancy a constant danger rather than a possible one. Free women faced different yet still substantial pressures. Marriage was partly an economic and political arrangement in which producing legitimate heirs formed a main social expectation. Having too many children could burden household resources. Having children under complicated conditions, since adultery was a legal offense with serious results under certain periods of Roman law, made reproductive management a practical requirement rather than a choice. Across cultures, the women most likely to possess contraceptive knowledge, and the strongest reasons to apply it consistently, were often those involved in the sex trade, the hetairai of ancient Greece, and the women working in the Roman brothels that operated as legal, regulated, and taxed parts of Roman city life. These women had the steadiest motivation to seek contraceptive approaches and the most ongoing need for knowledge that truly functioned. Some researchers have suggested that the keeping and passing on of contraceptive knowledge across ancient cultures owes more to this particular group than to formal medical traditions, precisely because the practical need was so direct and so significant. What overall view arises from all of this material? Ancient humans were making strong efforts to manage their reproduction. They were doing so across every culture, in every era for which evidence exists, using the plant knowledge and physical materials and conceptual systems available to them. The effectiveness of their efforts differed greatly from the meaningfully effective approaches of lactational amenorrhea and withdrawal, to the moderately effective spermicidal barrier techniques, to the pharmacologically genuine yet unreliable herbal preparations, to the pure placebo of amulets and rituals. The knowledge was mainly held and passed on by women, often informally shared between mothers and daughters and between women in the same community. It was not recorded in writing in the same manner that elite male medical knowledge was recorded, which means it is largely underrepresented in the historical record, even though it was practiced more widely than the remaining texts indicate. Cyrannus of Ephesus put things into writing. The grandmother, who informed her granddaughter which plants to prepare as a tea and when to use them, did not. And in terms of what people were actually doing in daily life, the grandmother's knowledge was almost certainly more widely shared and more regularly put into practice. The distance between what people sought, which was dependable reproductive management, and what they actually could obtain, which was a collection of partly effective approaches with substantial uncertainty about which ones worked and why, was a distance that lasted through essentially all of human history and was only truly reduced by the creation of modern hormonal contraception in the mid-20th century. Yet the wish that drove the development was not recent. It was not produced by modernity or the sexual revolution. It was present in the crocodile dung formulas of ancient Egypt and the Silphium trade of the ancient Mediterranean, and the herbal knowledge shared among women in every traditional society ever examined on every inhabited continent. The wish to engage in sexual activity without producing children, and the readiness to accept considerable risks and to use whatever resources were available to pursue that wish, is as ancient as the wish to engage in sexual activity itself, which, given all the evidence, is about as ancient as